The silence in their dining room was a physical presence, a third guest at the table. It sat between Paige and Grant, Baker, pushing them apart until the polished oak felt miles wide. Paige watched her husband move a piece of grilled chicken around his plate, his fork scraping softly against the ceramic. His eyes were distant, focused on something far beyond their pristine beige walls. 3 years. 3 years since the accident had scraped away the first 5 years of their life together, leaving her with a polite, handsome stranger and a collection of photographs that felt like someone else's vacation album. Tonight, the stranger felt more distant than ever. "How was your day at the firm?" she asked, her voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. Grant looked up, his focus snapping back to her for a moment. A flicker of something, weariness maybe, crossed his face before being replaced by a practiced, neutral mask. "Fine, the usual. Deposition for the Harrison case is heating up. That's good, right?" She tried to inject enthusiasm into her tone to be the supportive wife she was told she had always been. "It's work," he said, a non-answer that was becoming his trademark. He took a sip of water, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the encroaching darkness of the suburban evening. The rest of the meal passed in a similar staccato rhythm of failed conversation. Paige would offer a question. Grant would return a clipped, factual answer. There was no warmth, no shared joke, no lingering touch of hands across the table. She remembered the stories her mother had told her during her recovery. Stories of a whirlwind romance, of a man so in love he couldn't bear to be in a separate room from her. She looked at the man across from her, a man who seemed to be building walls around himself brick by silent brick, and felt a pang of loss for a love she couldn't even remember. Then it happened. His phone, lying face down beside his plate, buzzed. Not a loud ring, but a low, insistent vibration against the wood. Grant's entire posture changed. His shoulders tensed, and his eyes darted to the phone as if it were a venomous snake. He picked it up, angling the screen away from her with a movement so subtle it was clearly instinctive. His thumb moved quickly, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Who is it?" Paige asked, her voice smaller than she intended. His face tightened. "Nothing, just work stuff." He typed a quick reply and slid the phone into his pocket, the motion sharp and final. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. I need to work on that project in the garage." The excuse, the same one he'd used nearly every night for the past 4 months. It had started as an occasional thing, a way to decompress, he'd said. Now it was a ritual, dinner, silence, and then his escape. A knot of cold dread formed in Paige's stomach. "Grant, can't it wait? We could watch a movie or just talk." Her plea hung in the air, fragile and desperate. He paused at the door, his back to her. For a moment, she thought he might turn around, might close the distance between them. Instead, he just sighed, a sound heavy with a fatigue that seemed to go deeper than a long day at the office. "I can't tonight, Paige. I'm right in the middle of a tricky part. I'll be in later." He didn't wait for a reply. The door to the kitchen swung shut behind him, and a few seconds later, she heard the heavier thud of the door leading to the garage. She was alone again, surrounded by the hollow echoes of a life that wasn't hers. The loneliness was a physical ache. Paige stood and began clearing the table, her movements mechanical. She rinsed the plates, the warm water doing nothing to chase the chill from her hands. She walked through their house, a meticulously decorated cage of memories she hadn't made. On the mantelpiece, a photo of her and Grant on their wedding day. They were laughing, his arms wrapped around her, her head thrown back, in pure joy. The woman in that picture was a stranger, radiating a confidence Paige hadn't felt in 3 years. Who was she? And who was this man who now preferred the company of a dusty garage to his own wife? The cold dread in her stomach began to curdle into something sharper, something uglier, suspicion. The secret phone calls, the late nights, the emotional void. It all pointed to a singular, devastating conclusion. The thought was a poison seeping into the cracks of her fractured memory. She walked into the study, the room where Grant kept his legal books, and she kept her laptop. She sat down, the leather of the chair cool against her skin. Her hands trembled as she typed a search query into the browser. High-quality, discrete security cameras. Night vision. Motion activated. The screen filled with options. tiny electronic eyes promising to deliver the truth no matter how painful it might be. This was insane. This was something a paranoid, crazy person would do. But the woman in the photographs was gone, and the woman left in her place was a ghost in her own home. And a ghost would do anything to learn why she was being haunted. With a deep, shuddering breath, Paige clicked the link. She had to know. The crisp, manufactured warmth of the coffee shop felt like a different world from the chilly silence of her home. The air smelled of burnt sugar and roasted beans, a comforting aroma that did little to soothe the frantic buzzing beneath Paige's skin. She stirred her latte, watching the foam swirl into a meaningless pattern. Across the small table, Brooke Foster took a delicate sip of her cappuccino, her brow furrowed with concern. "You just seem off, Paige," Brooke said, setting her cup down. "For weeks now, is everything okay with Grant?" Paige had come here seeking reassurance, hoping her best friend would laugh off her fears and tell her she was being ridiculous. She wanted Brooke to provide a logical, innocent explanation for Grant's behavior, something that would allow her to cancel the order for the spy cameras currently in a shipping warehouse somewhere in Nevada. "I don't know." Paige began, her voice slowed. "He's just gone. Even when he's right there, he's out in the garage every single night. He gets these weird private texts. He barely looks at me anymore. It feels like I'm living with a roommate I barely know." She watched Brooke's face, searching for dismissal. Instead, she saw a flicker of something else. Pity, maybe, or a knowing sort of sadness. Brooke leaned forward, her expression turning serious. "Okay, honey, let's be clinical about this," she said, her tone shifting from concerned friend to pragmatic analyst. It was a tone Brooke, a successful marketing exec, used when diagnosing a failing ad campaign. "What are the signs?" "Secrecy with his phone." Paige nodded numbly. "He angles it away from me, puts it in his pocket the second I walk in the room." "Check," Brooke said, ticking an invisible box in the air. "Unexplained absences, new time-consuming hobbies that get him out of the house every night. The garage for hours. He says it's a project, but he's never told me what it is." "Check," Brooke repeated, her lips thinning. "Emotional distance, pulling away from physical contact, making you feel like you're the crazy one for noticing something is wrong." Paige's throat tightened. She thought of last night, of Grant's quick retreat, of the way he'd flinched almost imperceptibly when she tried to take his arm on the couch a few days ago. "Yes," she whispered. Brooke sat back, letting out a long, slow sigh. The analytical facade dropped, replaced by genuine sympathy. "Paige, I'm not saying it's definitely happening, but you remember what happened with Mark and Jenna from accounting? It started the exact same way. The late nights at the office that turned out to be a condo in the city, or Tom breaking up with me back in college. It was the secret phone calls that tipped me off. Every example with a hammer blow shattering Paige's fragile hope. She had wanted absolution, but Brooke was giving her evidence. "I'm just saying," Brooke continued, reaching across the table to squeeze Paige's hand. "Where there's smoke, there's usually fire. Men aren't that complicated. When they pull away like that, they're either running from something or running to someone." The words hung in the air, confirming every dark fear that had taken root in Paige's mind. She wasn't being paranoid. She was being observant. The cold dread she felt wasn't a product of her memory loss. It was intuition, a primal warning system telling her that the foundation of her life was about to crumble. "What should I do?" Paige asked, the words catching in her throat. "You have to protect yourself," Brooke said firmly. "Find out for sure. You can't live in this limbo. It's not fair to you. You've been through enough." The conversation ended soon after, filled with Brooke's well-meaning but agonizing advice on looking at phone bills and credit card statements. Paige drove home in a daze. The cheerful afternoon sun feeling like a cruel joke. Brooke's logic was inescapable. The signs were all there, a textbook case of infidelity. The garage wasn't a workshop. It was an alibi. The project wasn't a hobby. It was a cover story. She walked into the quiet house, the silence no longer feeling empty but heavy with deceit. She went straight to the study and opened her laptop. The tracking information for her order was on the screen. Estimated delivery tomorrow by 9:00 p.m. It wasn't soon enough. Fueled by a new bitter certainty, she navigated to Grant's online phone. Records using a password he'd given her years ago for an insurance claim, one she was sure he'd forgotten about. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the call log loaded. She scanned the numbers. Most were from his office or his mother, but there was one, a local number she didn't recognize that appeared almost daily. Short calls, always in the late afternoon, and a string of texts every single evening, right around dinner time. Her finger hovered over the search bar, ready to type in a number and find out who it belonged to. But she stopped. An online search would only give her a name. It wouldn't give her the truth. It wouldn't show her the look on his face. The cameras would. They would show her everything. With a grim sense of finality, she closed the browser. The decision was no longer a question of if, but when. The seeds of paranoia, watered by Brooke's logic and fertilized by a suspicious phone number, had bloomed into a thorny, unshakable conviction. She was no longer just a wife with doubts. She was a woman on the verge of uncovering a devastating betrayal, and she would be ready for it. The package arrived the next afternoon, a plain brown box with no distinguishing marks, left discreetly on the front porch. Paige carried it inside as if it were a bomb, her hands clammy. She stashed it in the back of her closet, hidden beneath a pile of winter sweaters, feeling like a criminal in her own home. The weight of her secret was immense, a physical pressure in her chest. All day she waited, flinching at every sound. Her nerves stretched thin. She needed Grant to be gone to give her a window of opportunity, however small. The call came just after 5 o'clock. "Hey," Grant's voice said over the line, sounding rushed. "Listen, I have to stop by the courthouse to drop off some files for the partners. I'm going to be late. Don't wait for me for dinner." "Oh, okay," she said, her heart starting to pound. This was it, her chance. "Everything all right?" "Yeah, fine. Just paperwork. I'll probably be an hour or two." "Drive safe," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. The moment she hung up, she flew into action. She retrieved the box from her closet and tore it open, her fingers fumbling with the packaging. Inside were 2 small black cameras, no bigger than a thumb, and a tangle of charging cords. The instructions were simple. Charge, sync to the app, place in a hidden location. With the components in her pocket, she crept to the door leading to the garage. She paused, her hand on the knob, her breath catching in her throat. This was his space, his sanctuary. Crossing this threshold felt like a profound violation. A final step over a line she could never uncross. Steeling herself, she turned the knob and slipped inside, pulling the door quietly shut behind her. The air in the garage was cool and smelled of oil, sawdust, and something metallic. Dust motes danced in the single beam of light slanting from a high window. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness, and the first thing she saw took her breath away. In the center of the 2-car garage, occupying the space where her own sedan should have been, was a massive object draped in a heavy gray canvas tarp. It was undeniably the shape of a car, a classic one from the looks of its curved lines. A wave of questions crashed over her. What is that? When did he buy a project car? Why? Hasn't he told me? Her first overwhelming instinct was to march over and rip the tarp off. Her hand even started to lift, but she stopped herself, a cold realization dousing her curiosity. Getting caught was the greater risk. If he came home and found her snooping, she'd lose everything, including the chance to learn the truth. Her mission was the cameras, not the car. That mystery could wait. Forcing her eyes away from the shrouded vehicle, she scanned the garage for hiding spots. The space was cluttered but organized. Tools hung neatly on a pegboard. Jars of screws and nails lined a shelf, and old paint cans were stacked in a corner. One high shelf crammed with old cardboard boxes offered a perfect vantage point of the entire garage. Standing on a stepladder, she tucked the first camera behind a dusty box labeled Christmas ornaments. The second spot was trickier. She needed a different angle, one that covered the side door and the workbench. She spotted a stack of old tires in the far corner. Kneeling down, she wedged the second camera into the space between the top 2 tires, aiming it toward the center of the room. Her hand was shaking now as she pulled out her phone and opened the app. Syncing the first camera was easy. A small green light confirmed the connection. A grainy wide-angle view of the garage appeared on her screen. She could see the tarp, covered car, the workbench, everything. She turned to the second camera, her thumb tapping nervously on her phone screen. Connecting. That's when she heard it. The low, familiar rumble of Grant's truck turning onto their street. Panic seized her. He was early. He wasn't supposed to be back for at least another hour. A frantic scramble ensued. The app was still trying to connect. Connection failed. No time. She shoved her phone in her pocket, grabbed the empty camera boxes, and practically leaped off the stepladder. She shoved the packaging deep into the recycling bin, her movements jerky and loud. She looked down, seeing the faint outline of her sneakers in the thick dust on the concrete floor. Swiping at them frantically with her sleeve, she smudged them into oblivion. The sound of the automatic garage door opener whirring to life was her final warning. There was no time to go back through the house. She lunged for the small side door that led to the backyard, wrenched it open, and slipped out into the fading daylight, pulling it shut with a soft click just as the main garage door began its slow, groaning ascent. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might break. She pressed herself against the side of the house, hidden by the bushes, listening, waiting. She heard his truck pull in, the engine cut off. A car door opened and closed. Then silence died. Peeking through the leaves of a hydrangea, she saw the main garage door rumble shut again, sealing him inside with her secrets. One camera was live, the other was not. It was a partial victory, but it would have to be enough. The trap was set, and now her weight was consumed by two burning questions. Was her husband having an affair? And what in God's name was he hiding under that tarp? The house felt like a theater set, and Paige felt like a woefully unprepared actor. Every word, every gesture was a performance. She feigned interest in a TV show she couldn't follow, the canned laughter grating on her frayed nerves. Grant sat at the other end of the couch, a book open on his lap. Though she hadn't seen him turn a page in 20 minutes, the space between them was a chasm filled with the static of unspoken accusations and hidden truths she was acutely aware of. Her laptop sitting on the coffee table, a gateway to the answers she both craved and dreaded. Grant finally closed his book with a soft sigh. "I'm beat," he said, rubbing his eyes. The statement was neutral, but Paige's suspicious mind immediately twisted it. Beat from what? From a long day of lying. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the living room lamp. "You've been quiet tonight. Just tired, I guess," she lied, her voice a little too thin. He seemed to accept it. Or perhaps he simply didn't have the energy to question her. He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her. It wasn't the distant, vacant look from dinner. This was different. There was a hesitancy there, a flicker of an emotion she couldn't name. Then, in a small, tentative gesture that felt monumental, he reached across the cushions and covered her hand with his. His touch was warm, his fingers gently curling around hers. It was a simple act of intimacy, the kind she had been starving for, but it felt like a brand. Her body reacted before her mind could. A reflexive, almost imperceptible flinch as his skin met hers. It was the physical manifestation of her weeks of suspicion, a recoiling from the man she believed was betraying her. The effect was immediate and devastating. The warmth in his hand vanished. He withdrew it as if he'd been burned, his face clouding over with a deep, unmistakable hurt. The light in his eyes, whatever it had been, was extinguished, replaced by that familiar, guarded exhaustion. The rejection had been hers, not his, and the sight of his pain sent a confusing wave of guilt through her. Heavy silence descended, thicker and more suffocating than before. He had tried to bridge the gap, and she had dynamited the bridge. Finally, he stood up, the movement stiff and weary. "I'm going to the garage," he said, his voice flat, all traces of vulnerability gone. He didn't offer an excuse about the project this time. He didn't need to. It was simply a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of their separate orbits. He walked out of the room without another word. Paige sat frozen on the couch, the phantom warmth of his hand still tingling on her skin. This moment felt like a turning point, a final, irreversible step. She had pushed him away, cementing the very distance she'd been lamenting. There was no going back now. The only path was forward into the truth. The sound of the garage door closing was her cue. She rose from the couch, her body feeling strangely heavy, and walked into her study. The darkness of the room was a comfort. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat at her desk and pulled the laptop towards her, the metal cool beneath her trembling fingers. She opened it. The screen cast a pale blue glow on her face. Her hands shook so violently it took 2 attempts to type in her password. The desktop wallpaper appeared, the smiling couple, from the wedding photo, mocking her. She ignored them, her focus entirely on the small icon for the camera app. She took a deep, ragged breath, held it, and double-clicked. A small window popped up, a loading symbol spinning in the center. It felt like an eternity. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. What will I see? A woman's car pulling up. Will he be on the phone, whispering to his lover? Will she be there waiting for him? Her mind spun with a dozen torturous scenarios, each one more painful than the last. Then the feed flickered to life. A grainy black and white image of the garage appeared on her screen. It was empty, save for the hulking tarp-covered shape in the middle. He wasn't there yet. She checked the timestamp. He had only just gone. Inside, she leaned closer to the screen, her eyes straining, her entire world shrinking to this single pixelated window. She watched the interior door from the house, the one he had just walked through. She held her breath, waiting. A moment later, the knob turned. The door swung open and Grant stepped into the frame. He was alone. Paige's first reaction was a wave of hollow relief. He was alone. There was no sleek sedan pulling in, no mysterious woman stepping out of the shadows, but the relief was fleeting, replaced by a profound confusion. He wasn't on the phone. He didn't seem to be waiting for anyone. He just stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumped, looking at the covered object in the center of the garage. She watched, her body braced for the other shoe to drop. He walked over to a large tool chest, unlocked it, and pulled on a pair of heavy-duty work gloves. Then he turned on a bright, industrial work light that flooded the garage with a harsh white glare, washing out the shadows and turning the grainy feed into a high-contrast tableau. He approached the shrouded object. With a slow, deliberate motion, he took a corner of the heavy canvas tarp and began to pull. The material slid off the unseen frame, pooling on the dusty concrete floor with a soft, heavy sound, and Paige stared, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. It wasn't a pristine sports car, a midlife crisis. Purchase. It was a wreck. The mangled skeletal remains of a car. Its bodywork, a patchwork of rust primer and dented metal. The front fender was crumpled, the hood was missing, and the entire driver's side was deeply scarred. But even in its ruined state, the shape was unmistakable. The iconic fastback silhouette, the distinctive triple taillights. It was a classic Ford Mustang. A knot of confusion tightened in Paige's chest. Why would Grant spend every night in the garage with a piece of junk? Her eyes narrowed, trying to make out the color under the dust and primer. She could see a few patches of the original paint. Faded flaking cherry red. A memory that wasn't a memory sparked in her mind. Photograph. She watched, mesmerized as Grant picked up a power sander. He switched it on, the low worrying sound barely audible through her laptop's tiny speakers. He placed it gently against a dented rear panel and began to work, his movements painstaking and focused. His face, illuminated by the stark light, was a portrait of intense concentration. But beneath it, she saw something else. It wasn't the furtive guilt of a cheater. It was a profound, bone-deep sorrow, a look of quiet determination, of a man on a mission that was breaking his heart. The red Mustang. The color snagged on something deep in the fog of her mind. It was important. Suddenly, she couldn't breathe. Shoving her chair back, she scrambled from the study and into the living room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. Her eyes scanned the built-in bookshelves flanking the fireplace, landing on a row of heavy leather-bound photo albums. Her hands shook as she pulled one down, the one labeled Our Beginning. She sank to the floor, flipping the thick plastic-covered pages with frantic energy. There were photos of their engagement party, their first apartment, vacations she couldn't recall. She passed the wedding section, her heart pounding a frantic tempo, and then there it was. The photograph was slightly faded, the colors muted by time. A much younger Grant and Paige, their faces alight with unadulterated joy. He had his arm around her, and she was leaning against the hood of a car, laughing at something he'd just said. The car was a gleaming, cherry red 1968 Ford Mustang, polished to a mirror shine. It was perfect. Beneath the photo, a caption was written in the elegant looping cursive she barely recognized as her own. The ink was slightly smeared, but the words were clear. Our first date, Starlight. Drive in, the beginning of everything. The album slipped from her fingers. The truth hit her not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping. The car in the garage. It was that car, her car, the one she'd been driving 3 years ago on a rain-slick road. The car she had been pulled from. The car that had been twisted into a metal tomb that had stolen her past. She looked from the vibrant, love-filled photograph to the laptop screen where the ghostly black and white image of her husband was tenderly trying to sand away the scars from a ghost. He wasn't meeting a new lover. He was trying to resurrect an old one. He wasn't building a new life with someone else. He was painstakingly, heartbreakingly trying to rebuild the one they had lost. Paige sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her forgotten life. The open photo album lay in her lap, a testament to a happiness she couldn't access. On the coffee table, the laptop screen continued to display the live feed from the garage, a silent, grainy film of her husband's secret grief. The two images, the vibrant past and the monochrome present, swam before her eyes, blurring into an unbearable truth. The suspicion that had poisoned her for months evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum that was instantly filled with a tidal wave of shame. Every cold glance she had given him, every suspicious question she had asked, every moment she had pulled away from his touch, it all replayed in her mind, now cast in the horrifying light of this new reality. She had been guarding herself against a betrayal that was never coming, while he had been silently, painstakingly trying to build a bridge back to her. She had accused him in her heart of erasing her, of moving on. But he had been doing the opposite. He had been digging through the wreckage of their shared history, trying to salvage the very foundation she had lost. He hadn't been running away from her. He had been engaged in a desperate, lonely quest to find her again. And he had done it all alone, bearing the weight of his hope and his fear in silence. Why hadn't he told her? The question surfaced through her guilt, and the answer was immediate and just as heartbreaking. Fear. The fear of failure. What if he spent a year of his life rebuilding that car only for it to mean nothing to her? What if the grand gesture fell flat, serving only as a painful reminder of the chasm between the woman he'd married and the woman she was now? He was protecting her, and maybe he was protecting himself, too, from the devastating possibility that the magic couldn't be recaptured, that their beginning was well and truly gone. Looking from the smiling, carefree girl in the photograph to the weary, solitary man on the screen, the dam of her composure finally broke. It wasn't a quiet, dignified cry. A raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of such profound anguish it seemed to belong to someone else. The tears came in a torrent, hot and furious. She wept for the man in the garage, laboring under the weight of a love he remembered perfectly for a woman who did not. She wept for her own foolishness, for the poison she had allowed to grow in the space his silence had created. And she wept for the sheer, staggering, beautiful tragedy of it all, that the thing she had mistaken for abandonment was in fact the most profound act of devotion she could possibly imagine. She pressed her forehead to the cool wood of the floor, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. She cried until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, purging herself of the bitterness and suspicion. The storm of emotion raged, and then slowly it began to subside, leaving behind an aching clarity. The guilt remained, a heavy stone in her chest, but it was now joined by something else. A fierce, protective love that was sharper and more real than any secondhand story or faded photograph. This love wasn't a memory. It was a feeling forged in this moment of devastating revelation. He was out there alone in the dark, fighting a battle for a past she might never recover. She couldn't let him, not for one more night. Her tears slowed, replaced by a steely resolve that straightened her spine. This silent suffering had to end. The secrets and the surveillance, the distance and the doubt. It was a prison of their own making, and she finally had the key. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a damp streak across her cheek. She walked over to the laptop, and with a decisive click closed the application. She would not be a spy in her own marriage for a second longer. She would be a wife. With a deep breath that did little to calm the frantic beating of her heart, she turned away from the living room, away from the ghosts and the photo albums. Her steps were firm, and purposeful as she walked through the kitchen, not towards the bedroom where she would normally wait, but towards the heavy door that led to the garage. It was time to face the man she had wronged and the beautiful broken symbol of the love he had never lost. Paige's hand rested on the cold metal door knob for a long moment. She could hear the low, rhythmic hum of the sander from the other side. Taking one last, fortifying breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The sudden flood of warm light from the kitchen sliced through the garage's stark, industrial glare. Grant jumped, startled, the sander falling silent in his hand. He spun around, his body instinctively moving to block her view of the car, a gesture of someone caught in a deeply private act. His face was a mask of shock and alarm. "Paige, what are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice strained, a note of panic underneath. "It's late." She didn't answer his question. She ignored his attempt to shield the vehicle, her eyes fixed on the mangled chassis behind him. She took a slow step into the garage, the doors swinging shut behind her, plunging them back into the focused bubble of the work light. She could see it all clearly now. The painstaking work, the neatly organized tools, the diagrams spread across the workbench. She walked closer, her gaze tracing the crumpled lines of the driver's side door, the place where her life had irrevocably fractured. "The Starlight Drive-In," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it carried across the concrete floor with the force of a shout. Grant froze. All the color drained from his face, leaving him pale under the harsh light. The defensiveness in his posture crumbled, replaced by a look of utter defeat. He looked from her face to the wrecked car and back again, the frantic calculations visible in his eyes. He knew somehow that she knew. "How?" he started, his voice cracking. "I saw you," she confessed, her own shame surfacing. "I was sure you were having an affair. I put cameras in here." The admission hung in the air between them, ugly and raw. A flicker of hurt crossed his features at her words, but it was quickly subsumed by a wave of weary resignation. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his broad shoulders slumping as if a great weight had finally crushed him. He leaned a hand against the car's rusted roof, no longer trying to hide it. "I didn't know how to tell you," whispered, his eyes finding a spot on the floor. "I found it in a scrapyard in Stockton. Took me 6 months just to track it down. I thought if I could just fix it, if I could make it perfect again." He trailed off, shaking his head. "You thought you could make me perfect again?" she finished for him, the realization settling deep in her bones. He finally looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I thought if I could recreate that night, our first date, maybe something would click. Maybe you'd remember. Just a little piece of feeling. I just wanted to give you back a piece of what you lost, of what we lost." His voice broke on the last words. "I was so afraid," he confessed, the words pouring out of him now in a raw, ragged stream. "I was terrified of failing. What if I spent all this time, all this money, and you looked at it and felt nothing? Or worse, what if it just brought back the trauma of the accident? I couldn't bear the thought of hurting you more. It was easier to hide out here and just try. It was stupid." "No," she said, her own tears beginning to fall again. But these were different tears. They were not for what was lost, but for what she had just found. She closed the remaining space between them, her own fear and guilt dissolving in the face of his raw vulnerability. She reached out, placing a hand on the cool, sanded metal of the car door. The metal was smooth where he had worked, a small patch of hope amidst the wreckage. Then she reached up with her other hand and gently cupped his cheek, his skin rough with stubble. He flinched slightly at her touch before leaning into it, a silent surrender. "It wasn't stupid, Grant," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It was the most beautiful thing anyone has ever done." She looked into his eyes, wanting him to see the truth of her words. "You didn't need to bring back a memory for me. Don't you see? For 3 years, I've been living with stories, with photographs. But this," she pressed her hand harder against the car. "This is real. You didn't spend months trying to rebuild our past." He looked at her confused as a single tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. She gave him a watery smile. "You spent all this time all alone in the dark building our future." In that moment, under the harsh glare of a single work light and surrounded by the ghosts of a life forgotten, the emotional chasm that had separated them for so long finally completely closed. He covered her hand with his, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. 6 months later, the garage was a different place. The solitary silence had been replaced by the easy rhythm of teamwork. The air, once heavy with secrets, now buzzed with the sounds of a shared project. The ratchet clicking as Paige tightened a bolt. The classic rock station playing softly from a portable radio. And most importantly, the sound of laughter. After that night, everything changed. The garage door remained open, both literally and figuratively. Paige started spending her evenings out there with Grant. At first just watching, bringing him coffee. But soon she was learning the difference between a socket wrench and a torque wrench. She found a surprising satisfaction in the methodical work, in breathing new life into the old machine. They worked side by side, their hands stained with the same grease, their conversations shifting from strained pleasantries to comfortable debates over engine parts and upholstery samples. They weren't just rebuilding a car. They were rebuilding their partnership piece by painstaking piece. There had been difficult conversations, too. One Saturday morning, Paige met Brooke for coffee again back at the same table. She told her everything, the cameras, the car, the heartbreaking truth. Brooke's face had crumpled with horrified regret. "Oh, Paige, I'm so sorry," she'd said, her eyes welling with tears. "I was just applying the standard playbook. I never imagined. I feel like I made everything so much worse." "You were being a good friend with the information you had," Paige had replied, reaching across to take her hand. "But our story doesn't have a standard playbook." Their friendship, once strained by misguided advice, was mended, stronger now for having weathered the truth. Tonight was the culmination of all of it. The 1968 Ford Mustang, no longer a wreck, but a masterpiece, gleamed under the twilight sky. Its cherry red paint was so deep it looked wet, and the chrome bumpers reflected the first stars of the evening. Grant, wearing a nervous smile, held the passenger door open for her. The interior smelled of new leather and old dreams. They drove through town, turning heads at every intersection. The engine rumbled, a deep, contended sound that vibrated through the floorboards. They didn't talk much, the shared sense of accomplishment filling the comfortable silence. Soon they were pulling off the main road and up a gravel lane, coming to a stop before the iconic glowing sign, the Starlight Drive-In. It was one of the last of its kind. Rows of cars were already parked in angled spots, their occupants silhouetted against the enormous flickering screen. Grant found a perfect spot near the back, killed the engine, and hung the crackling metal speaker from Paige's half-open window. A classic black and white movie was playing, one she'd never seen. They sat in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the film, but not really seeing it. The cool night air drifted into the car, carrying the scent of popcorn and summer grass. This moment was what it had all been for it. Finally, Grant turned to her, his expression open and vulnerable in the flickering light from the screen. "Does any of this," he began, his voice soft, hesitant, "does any of it feel familiar?" It was the question that had lingered unspoken through all their months of work, the quiet hope he had harbored from the very beginning. Paige looked away from his earnest face, out at the massive screen, at the other cars, at the canopy of stars above. She searched within herself, not for a memory, but for a feeling, a spark of recognition. She found none. The past was still a locked room. But looking back at the man beside her, at his hopeful, loving face, she realized with absolute certainty that it didn't matter. She reached across the console and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. His skin was warm and familiar. "No," she said, her voice clear and honest. There was no disappointment in her tone, only peace. He started to look away, a shadow of sadness crossing his features, but she squeezed his hand, drawing his gaze back to hers. "It doesn't feel familiar at all," she continued, a slow smile spreading across her face. "But I will remember this moment right here. The way the light is hitting your face, the sound of that speaker, the feel of your hand in mine. I will remember every second of it." She leaned closer, her eyes holding his dot. "This is our first date." He stared at her, the last of his long-held tension melting away, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated love. He didn't need to reclaim the past anymore. They were creating a new one right now. He leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that wasn't about remembering, but about beginning. It was a promise sealed under the flickering Light of the silver screen in a universe of endless stars.